Today, you've chosen to speak out for the first time. Why have you decided?
The discovery. Winter descended upon the Swiss Alps with its customary silence, transforming the village of Verbier into a postcard of pristine isolation. Here, among the chalets owned by billionaires and titans of industry, stood a property that had become synonymous with scandal, the holiday villa of Prince Andrew, Duke of York. For years, this £13 million refuge had served as the Duke's escape from the relentless scrutiny of British tabloids and the whispered conversations in palace corridors. But in February of 2023, what began as a routine property inspection would unravel secrets that reached far beyond the snow-covered peaks. The discovery came not from investigators or journalists, but from an unexpected quarter. Marie-Claire Dubois, a local property manager hired to oversee maintenance during the Duke's extended absence, noticed something peculiar during what should have been a standard walkthrough. The villa had remained empty for 18 months, an unusual duration even by the standards of the ultra-wealthy. Prince Andrew, by then largely withdrawn from public life following the catastrophic Newsnight interview and the subsequent settlement with Virginia Giuffre, had not returned to his alpine sanctuary. The property stood silent, accumulating dust and questions in equal measure. Dubois entered through the service entrance on that February morning, her breath forming clouds in the unheated interior. The villa sprawled across 6 floors, each room more opulent than the last. Persian rugs stretched across marble floors. Chandeliers imported from Venetian glassmakers hung dormant in the dining room. Paintings, some bearing signatures that made Dubois pause and reach for her phone, lined the walls in gilt frames. But it was not the obvious displays of wealth that caught her attention. It was the locked door on the 3rd floor, set back in a corridor she had never been asked to clean. Property managers develop instincts about spaces. They learn to read the architecture of secrets. This door, unremarkable in its construction, bore a lock far more sophisticated than those securing rooms filled with crystal and art. Dubois had her instructions: inspect, document, report. But the door presented a problem. It appeared on no floor plan she had been given. According to the official blueprints filed with the local authorities, this section of the 3rd floor should not exist. She contacted the property's legal representatives in London, a firm whose letterhead featured an address in Mayfair and whose partners counted several members of the aristocracy among their clients. The conversation, she would later recall, felt oddly scripted. She was told to leave the door alone, that it contained personal items of no consequence, family heirlooms, and private correspondence, but legal firms do not typically grow nervous about heirlooms. Their anxiety carries a different frequency, one Dubois recognized from her years managing properties for people who had much to hide. What happened next remains disputed. Some accounts suggest Dubois contacted Swiss authorities out of concern about insurance liabilities. Others whisper of financial incentives, a tabloid payment that could transform a property manager into a comfortable retiree. The truth likely occupies the murky territory between duty and opportunity. Regardless of motivation, within 72 hours, representatives from the local police arrived at the villa, accompanied by lawyers and a locksmith who specialized in high-security mechanisms. The door opened to reveal a room that should not have existed. Approximately 20 square meters, windowless, climate-controlled to museum specifications. The air that emerged carried the scent of leather and paper, of documents carefully preserved. What they found inside would send tremors through Buckingham Palace and raise questions that the royal family had desperately hoped were buried forever. The room contained filing cabinets, 7 in total, each meticulously organized. Inside were documents spanning 3 decades, financial records detailing transactions that wound through offshore accounts in jurisdictions famous for their opacity, correspondence between the Duke and individuals whose names appeared regularly in investigations into international arms deals and questionable business practices. Photographs, some innocent, others deeply compromising, arranged in albums with dates and locations noted in careful script. And perhaps most damaging, documents that appeared to be insurance, records kept not for memory, but for protection. Among the files sat evidence of the Duke's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein that went far beyond what had been publicly acknowledged. Flight logs that did not match official statements, records of payments made through intermediaries, communications that revealed a friendship built not just on social convenience, but on mutual benefit of a kind that made even seasoned investigators uncomfortable. The Duke had always maintained that his relationship with the convicted sex offender was a mistake of judgment, nothing more. These documents suggested a narrative far more complex and considerably darker. But the Epstein materials, explosive as they were, represented only part of the discovery. The cabinets also contained evidence of the Duke's business dealings, the web of relationships he had cultivated over decades as Britain's special representative for trade and investment. Names of dictators and oligarchs appeared alongside records of payments and favors exchanged. The line between royal duty and personal enrichment had blurred into non-existence. Here was documentation of a parallel life, one lived in the shadows of diplomatic privilege, where a prince could broker deals that would land ordinary citizens in prison. The Swiss authorities, acutely aware of the diplomatic implications, moved with careful deliberation. Photographs were taken, documents were catalogued, and then, in a decision that would later face intense scrutiny, they contacted the British Embassy in Bern. What happened in the hours that followed remains partially sealed behind diplomatic protocols and national security classifications. But the outlines are clear enough. The royal family had been presented with a crisis that threatened not just one member, but the institution itself. The palace response. News of the discovery reached Buckingham Palace through encrypted channels, delivered first to the private secretary, and then, with careful phrasing, to King Charles himself. The king, barely 6 months into his reign following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, faced a dilemma his mother had spent her final years quietly managing. Prince Andrew had been a problem for decades, his behavior a constant source of anxiety for palace officials who spent their careers managing scandals. But this was different. This was evidence, meticulously preserved, of activities that could not be explained away with vague statements about errors in judgment. The meeting convened in one of the palace's private offices, away from the state rooms where tourists wandered and photographers gathered. Present were the king, his private secretary, the master of the household, and legal counsel whose expertise lay in the intersection of constitutional law and crisis management. Also present via secure video link was Sir Edward Llewellyn, a former diplomat whose experience negotiating sensitive international situations made him invaluable in moments like these. Charles, according to sources familiar with the meeting, listened in silence as the situation was outlined. His brother had kept insurance files. The implication was clear and deeply personal. Andrew had not just engaged in questionable behavior, he had documented it, creating an insurance policy against the day when the family might move to distance themselves permanently. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than tabloid scandals or embarrassing interviews. It suggested a man who trusted no one, not even his own blood. The legal assessment was blunt. If these documents became public, the damage would be catastrophic. Criminal investigations would likely follow, not just in Britain but in multiple jurisdictions. The Duke faced potential prosecution. But beyond Andrew's personal liability, the files threatened to expose decades of royal tolerance for behavior that should have triggered intervention years earlier. The palace had known, or should have known, about aspects of the Duke's life that were now documented in meticulous detail. Their failure to act would be scrutinized mercilessly. The discussion turned to options, each worse than the last. They could claim diplomatic immunity, but that would spark outrage and potentially a constitutional crisis. They could cooperate fully with any investigation. But that meant exposing the monarchy to accusations that would dominate news cycles for years. Or they could attempt to contain the situation through negotiation and, if necessary, pressure applied through channels that exist in the gray areas of international relations. King Charles made a decision that would define the early months of his reign. There would be no cover-up, he declared. but neither would there be unnecessary exposure. The palace would cooperate with legitimate legal inquiries while protecting information that was genuinely sensitive from a national security perspective. It was a middle path that satisfied no one but perhaps prevented the worst outcomes. More significantly, the king made clear that his brother's time as a working royal was finished permanently. There would be no rehabilitation, no gradual return to public duties. Prince Andrew was, in effect, excommunicated from the only life he had ever known. But the king's decision addressed only the official response. Privately, the royal family was fracturing. Prince William, already wary of his uncle's influence and protective of the monarchy's reputation, argued for complete transparency. Let the truth emerge, he insisted, and deal with the consequences. Better a painful reckoning now than years of drip-feed revelations. Princess Anne, the king's sister, took a harder line. She had never hidden her contempt for Andrew's behavior and saw this as confirmation of everything she had long believed. Her position was stark. Remove him from the family entirely, strip him of titles and allowances, and let him face justice without the shield of royal protection. The queen consort, Camilla, observed these family discussions with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned painful lessons about public perception. She understood that the monarchy's survival depended not on protecting its members, but on demonstrating that no one stood above accountability. Yet she also recognized the human dimension. This was her husband's brother, a relationship complicated by childhood memories and family bonds that did not vanish simply because of scandal. Prince Andrew himself remained in Royal Lodge, the 30-room mansion in Windsor Great Park that he had fought so hard to retain. When informed of the discovery, his reaction oscillated between defiance and panic. He insisted that the documents were being misinterpreted, that context was being ignored. But his arguments convinced no one. The files were too detailed, too carefully maintained to be dismissed as innocent record-keeping. They represented a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had prepared for the day when it would all come to light. The conversations between Charles and Andrew during this period, conducted away from staff and recording devices, would remain private. But those who saw the brothers in the aftermath described a relationship shattered beyond repair. Charles had spent years defending Andrew, absorbing criticism from advisors who believed the Duke should have been removed from royal duties decades earlier. Now the evidence of his brother's duplicity sat in a locked room in Switzerland, a monument to misplaced loyalty. The palace's official statement, when it finally emerged, was a masterpiece of controlled language. It acknowledged that certain materials had been discovered during a routine property inspection. It confirmed that the Duke was cooperating fully with appropriate authorities. It expressed the family's commitment to transparency while respecting ongoing legal processes. What it did not mention were the sleepless nights, the furious arguments, and the dawning realization that the monarchy had come within a hair's breadth of catastrophic damage. Behind the statement lay a frantic effort to understand the full scope of the problem. Forensic accountants were hired to trace financial transactions. Intelligence services were quietly asked to assess national security implications, and lawyers began the delicate work of negotiating with Swiss authorities, seeking to control what information would be released and when. The palace was in crisis mode, a state it had occupied with increasing frequency as scandals mounted in recent years. The contents revealed. As spring arrived in London, details of the villa's contents began to emerge through carefully managed leaks and court filings. Each revelation built upon the last, creating a portrait of Prince Andrew that diverged sharply from the image he had long cultivated. The Duke had presented himself as a somewhat buffoonish figure, a man whose greatest sins were vanity and poor judgment. The file suggested something far more calculating. The financial documents proved particularly damaging. They revealed a complex network of offshore accounts, trusts established in locations like the British Virgin Islands and Panama, and transactions that appeared designed to obscure the source and destination of funds. Over a period spanning from 1995 to 2018, approximately £12 million had flowed through these accounts, money whose origins remain murky despite intensive investigation. Some funds appeared to be connected to the Duke's work as a trade envoy, a role he had held from 2001 to 2011. During that decade, Andrew had traveled the world promoting British business interests, meeting with government officials and corporate leaders. The position had been controversial from the start, with critics questioning whether a member of the royal family should be involved in commercial activities. The files now suggested that the Duke had used his position for personal enrichment, accepting payments from individuals and companies that benefited from his royal connections. One file detailed a relationship with Timur Kulibayev, a Kazakh oligarch and son-in-law of Kazakhstan's former dictator. The Duke had helped facilitate business deals involving Kulibayev's interests in Britain, including the controversial sale of the Duke's former marital home for £3 million above the asking price. The files contained correspondence that made clear this was not a simple real estate transaction, but part of a broader pattern of mutual benefit. Andrew provided access and influence. Kulibayev provided money channeled through mechanisms designed to maintain plausible deniability. Another set of documents concerned the Duke's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, the American financier whose crimes had shocked the world. Andrew had always maintained that he had not been aware of Epstein's activities, that their friendship was social rather than substantive. The files painted a different picture. There were records of flights not previously disclosed, visits to properties where Epstein's abuse occurred, and communications that suggested a far deeper involvement than the Duke had ever admitted. Most damaging were the photographs. Not the infamous image of Andrew with his arm around Virginia Giuffre, which had been explained away as potentially doctored, but dozens of other images from various occasions over many years. The Duke appeared relaxed, comfortable, embedded in Epstein's world in ways that belied his later claims of casual acquaintance. There were images from Epstein's island in the Caribbean, from his mansion in New York, from parties attended by powerful men and young women whose presence raised obvious questions. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the files was what they revealed about the Duke's mindset. Interspersed among the financial records and photographs were notes, some handwritten, others typed, that amounted to a running commentary on his own life. These notes revealed a man consumed by grievance, convinced that he was underappreciated and unfairly criticized. There were bitter observations about other members of the royal family, accusations that they had failed to support him, suggestions that they were jealous of his success and popularity. The notes also revealed the Duke's awareness that his activities might someday face scrutiny. He had kept these files not out of nostalgia, but as leverage, insurance against the day when the family might move against him. In one particularly chilling passage, dated 2019, shortly after the Epstein scandal had erupted anew, Andrew wrote that he had taken steps to ensure his protection. If the palace attempted to sacrifice him, he noted, they would discover that he was not without resources. This revelation transformed the narrative. The royal family was not simply dealing with a member who had made mistakes, they were confronting someone who had weaponized information against his own relatives. The files were a form of blackmail, kept current over decades, a reminder that Andrew would not go quietly if the family decided he had become too much of a liability. The intelligence services, reviewing the materials at the palace's request, identified additional concerns. Some of the Duke's contacts had connections to foreign intelligence services. There were indications that Andrew, whether knowingly or not, had been cultivated by individuals seeking to exploit his position for espionage purposes. While there was no evidence that the Duke had betrayed state secrets, the potential for compromise was clear. He had been reckless in ways that went beyond personal scandal and touched upon national security. As these details emerged, public opinion hardened. Whatever sympathy Andrew had retained after the Giuffre settlement evaporated. The files revealed not a man who had made errors in judgment, but someone who had spent decades operating in ethical shadows, using his royal status to enrich himself and protect behaviors that would have destroyed an ordinary citizen's life. The gap between the Duke's public image and his private reality proved too vast to bridge. The family reckoning. Within the walls of Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, the discovery forced conversations that had been delayed for decades. The royal family, so adept at presenting a seamless image of unity, found itself splintered by anger, fear, and competing notions of duty. These were not formal meetings, but tense exchanges in corridors and private rooms, whispered arguments about what loyalty means when it collides with institutional survival. King Charles found himself caught between blood and duty. As monarch, he bore responsibilities that transcended personal feeling. The crown was not a family, but an institution that had endured for 1,000 years by adapting to threat and scandal. Yet Charles was also a brother who remembered Andrew as a mischievous boy at Balmoral, a naval officer full of promise, a son their late mother had defended. He could not erase those memories simply because the world now demanded punishment. His private conversations with Prince William became increasingly strained. William, conscious that he would one day inherit not only the throne but the burden of restoring faith in it, argued that sentiment could no longer dictate policy. The monarchy's survival depended on proving that no royal stood above consequence. To protect the crown, Andrew had to face full accountability. But Charles, haunted by his own public vilification during the years of his divorce from Diana, hesitated. He knew what exile felt like, the silence, the humiliation, and could not bring himself to condemn his brother utterly. Princess Anne's stance was colder. Decades of dutiful service had left her impatient with indulgence. She had carried hundreds of engagements each year while Andrew basked in privilege. For her, the villa revelations were not shocking. They confirmed what she had always known, that Andrew believed himself untouchable. "He's always thought the rules were for other people," she reportedly remarked. Her fury was not only moral but practical. His disgrace had tainted the institution she had spent her life preserving. The Queen Consort, Camilla, added a quieter but firm perspective. She knew the cruelty of the press, the sting of being cast as a villain, yet she recognized the line between personal missteps and moral collapse. What the files revealed went beyond error into exploitation. She supported her husband, but urged him privately to make decisive choices before public anger consumed them all. Prince Edward and Sophie, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, observed the turmoil with quiet dread. They had built lives defined by diligence rather than drama, yet the scandal threatened to engulf everyone. Reporters now questioned what the family had known and when. Edward, once close to Andrew, felt a dull grief. His brother had become a stranger. The next generation, too, could not escape its pull. Across the Atlantic, Prince Harry watched from California with conflicted emotions. The headlines seemed to echo every criticism he had ever made of the institution's misplaced loyalties. "They protect the wrong people," he had said, and now, before the world's eyes, that belief appeared justified. Yet satisfaction eluded him. Andrew was still family, a flawed, fallen uncle. The scandal confirmed that the dysfunction he had fled was not imagined, it was embedded. For Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, the ordeal was devastating. They adored their father, had defended him publicly even as his reputation collapsed. But the villa files made defense impossible. The evidence was overwhelming. They faced a cruel choice: stand by him and risk their own credibility, or distance themselves and be accused of betrayal. Behind palace walls, they begged him to cooperate, to show contrition, to end the fight. He refused, insisting he had been wronged. Their love turned to exhaustion. Inside the palace's tempers flared. Courtiers, accustomed to restraint, now heard raised voices behind closed doors. In one confrontation, Charles, pushed to the edge by William's demand for absolute transparency, shouted that destroying Andrew would not cure the monarchy's deeper sickness. William countered that sparing him would doom it. The divide between father and son, once theoretical, became generational, one clinging to mercy, the other to survival. Outside, the pressure intensified. Each new revelation from the villa files unleashed another wave of outrage. Parliamentary committees demanded inquiries into royal finances. Protesters gathered outside palace gates with signs reading, "Accountability for all." The scandal had expanded beyond Andrew to the system that had shielded him. How had he maintained offshore accounts unnoticed? Who had approved his dealings? How many others operated in similar shadows? The monarchy had weathered storms before, abdications, divorces, deaths, but this one felt different. The Epstein link had been about judgment, the Giuffre settlement about morality. The Villa files were structural, exposing an ecosystem of privilege where oversight was optional and consequence negotiable. It was no longer about one man's disgrace, but an institution's failure to enforce its own rules. Public patience thinned. Commentators who once defended the monarchy now questioned its relevance. Polls showed falling support among younger Britons. Even traditionally loyal newspapers began calling for reform fit for a modern democracy. Within the palace, senior courtiers whispered of transparency audits, reduced expenses, and permanent downsizing of the working royals. Charles understood that the crisis had forced an irreversible shift. The old mystique, built on silence and distance, no longer protected them. If the monarchy was to survive, it would have to surrender the illusion of infallibility. For centuries, the family had treated scandal as something to be buried. Now, concealment itself was the scandal. William emerged as the advocate of reform, arguing that the future of the crown depended on authenticity, not perfection. Anne backed him, pragmatic as ever. Camilla, though sympathetic to her husband's hesitation, conceded privately that William was right, and Charles, weary from the weight of both throne and conscience, began to accept what he had resisted from the start, that protecting Andrew meant endangering everything else. In time, official statements were issued, carefully worded acknowledgments of wrongdoing without explicit condemnation. Behind their restrained language, the message was unmistakable. The era of automatic forgiveness had ended. Andrew was to live quietly, indefinitely, without title or public role. Within those ancient walls, something fundamental shifted. The monarchy, once the embodiment of continuity, found itself forced to change or perish. The Villa files had not only destroyed a prince, they had exposed a truth long whispered but rarely admitted, that the greatest threat to the crown had never been its enemies, but the failings of those within it. Fallout: the unraveling of a prince. By summer, the immediate crisis had hardened into something slower and more punishing, a grinding process of legal proceedings, negotiations, and incremental disclosures that refused to fade from the headlines. What had begun as a scandal now evolved into a reckoning. Prince Andrew had been formally stripped of all remaining patronages and military appointments, a process that had begun after the Giuffre settlement but was now completed with an unmistakable sense of finality. His office at Buckingham Palace was shuttered, his longtime staff dismissed, his official stationery destroyed. He was no longer permitted to use the style His Royal Highness in any capacity. The title of Duke of York remained technically, but it existed only as a courtesy, not as a reflection of any working royal status. The villa itself became the epicenter of a transnational legal storm. Swiss authorities, coordinating with British financial investigators, pored over the files recovered from the property. Thousands of documents revealed a maze of offshore transfers, shell companies, and discreet intermediaries. Several accounts were frozen pending investigation, their holders summoned for questioning. Lawyers spoke in cautious tones about complex structures, but the implication was clear. A network built to obscure accountability was finally being untangled. Forensic accountants traced money flows that linked old acquaintances, former aides, and business associates who had long operated in the gray zone surrounding royal privilege. For the royal family, the aftermath meant navigating a transformed landscape. The old equilibrium, where discretion shielded misjudgments, had shattered. In his first major address to Parliament as sovereign, King Charles spoke of renewal through transparency, a phrase that every journalist immediately recognized as an oblique reference to his disgraced brother. He announced a suite of reforms: independent audits of royal finances, stricter rules on outside business interests, and clearer lines separating personal wealth from public duty. These measures, once considered too radical, now appeared indispensable to the survival of the monarchy itself. Public scrutiny turned fierce. The Crown Estate and the sovereign grant, through which royal funding was distributed, came under unprecedented parliamentary review. Committees demanded line-by-line accounting: who was paid what, for what purpose, and under whose authority. The discovery of the villa's hidden transactions ignited a broader debate about whether taxpayers should continue financing an institution that had so often blurred the boundary between service and self-interest. Newspapers published exposés on royal spending. Television panels debated abolition. The monarchy, though not in immediate danger, was undeniably changed. Meanwhile, Prince Andrew withdrew into near seclusion. Royal Lodge, the mansion he had fought to retain despite mounting pressure, became a gilded confinement. He ventured out rarely, usually for solitary rides through Windsor Great Park or short trips to church under discreet escort. Each outing risked a photograph, an unflattering image that would reappear in tabloids as proof of his humiliation. Old friends, once eager for proximity to power, quietly disengaged. His phone, once buzzing with invitations, now stayed mostly silent. Within palace circles, his name was spoken in lowered tones, a reminder of how swiftly a prince could become a pariah. His daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, remained dutiful but distant. They visited regularly, bringing their children, attempting to preserve a semblance of family connection. Yet beneath the polite conversations lay exhaustion and quiet resentment. Both women were carving independent lives, far removed from their father's shadow. Their careers, their charitable work, their marriages, all depended on a fragile separation from his scandals. Each time their names resurfaced in connection with Andrew, the progress they had built threatened to unravel. Love endured, but it was burdened by disappointment and by the silent fear that proximity might once again cost them their peace. The legal process, meanwhile, crept forward with the glacial precision of international law. Prosecutors in Switzerland, Britain, and the United States examined whether the financial records supported criminal charges. The Duke retained a phalanx of lawyers, seasoned specialists in white-collar defense and reputation management. Yet even the most skilled legal minds could not erase what the documents exposed: a pattern of influence, entitlement, and questionable associations that no court ruling could fully absolve. Diplomatic ripples followed. Republican movements in Australia, Canada, and the Caribbean seized upon the scandal as evidence that the monarchy was an outdated relic unfit for modern democracy. Editorials called for referendums for constitutions without crowns. Allied governments, particularly those whose officials had once met Andrew during his tenure as a trade envoy, voiced discomfort. They asked privately what promises or introductions he had made and whether those dealings had blurred lines between public duty and personal gain. In Washington, American authorities reopened aspects of the Epstein investigation, citing fresh material from the Villa archives. The FBI requested access to correspondence detailing the Duke's visits to Epstein's properties and his communications with known associates. The British government, anxious to preserve intelligence cooperation with its most vital ally, entered delicate negotiations. The outcome was a set of carefully worded agreements that satisfied neither side completely but prevented diplomatic fracture. As months stretched into a year, public outrage gave way to a colder, quieter acceptance. Prince Andrew's reputation was beyond salvage. He had become, as one commentator wrote, a ghost of privilege wandering through the ruins of his own making. The royal family endured, but its veneer of moral authority was chipped and scarred. Inside the palace, courtiers spoke of lessons learned, though privately they feared what other secrets might still lie buried in properties or accounts yet unexamined. King Charles often reflected in solitude on what the crisis had revealed. He had long known his brother's weaknesses: impulsiveness, vanity, a fatal trust in the wrong people, but he had underestimated their cost. The Villa files had forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth: that the family's instinct to protect its own had, in practice, protected misconduct. The revelation was not only about Andrew's guilt, but about the monarchy's collective blindness, the culture of silence that had enabled him for so long. The monarchy, as ever, would endure. It had weathered abdication, war, divorce, and death. But this time, endurance required transformation. The new reign would be defined less by mystique than by accountability. The gilded certainties of an earlier era were gone, replaced by the austere knowledge that public trust, once lost, could only be rebuilt slowly and painfully. And so the villa in Verbier, once a retreat of opulence and secrecy, became something far more symbolic, a monument to the perils of unchecked privilege. In its shuttered windows and emptied rooms lay the lesson that no title, however ancient, could shield its bearer from consequence forever. The scandal had begun as one man's disgrace. It ended as a mirror held up to an entire institution. What began as a routine property inspection ended with revelations that shook the British monarchy to its foundations. The villa's secrets forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about privilege, accountability, and the lengths to which one member of the royal family would go to protect himself, even from his own relatives. Subscribe for more untold stories from inside the palace walls.